All right, let's go to former UK Prime Minister Liz Truss. And Liz, on the topic of Greenland, we don't know a lot about the deal, but based upon what we ultimately do know, is this a win for the U.S. and European allies alike?
Well, I think it's something that needed to happen. The Arctic has become a key geostrategic field where there is huge threat from Russia and China. Something needed to happen, and I'm glad that there is now a framework where allies in the US and Europe can get on with doing the deal.
Here's more from the President Trump on this framework from yesterday. Listen.
Well, the deal is going to be put out pretty soon. I mean, we'll see. It's right now a little bit in progress, but pretty far along. It gets us everything we needed to get. It puts everybody in a really good position, especially as it pertains to security and minerals.
And Liz, let's be absolutely realistic. This was always the most likely outcome. Troops on the ground invading, quote unquote, Greenland was likely never going to happen. So why did European leaders nevertheless push back so much against President Trump on a move that ultimately makes them more secure from threats like Russia and China?
Well, European leaders are still living in the old world. They call it the international rules-based global order. Unfortunately, what we've seen is the United Nations has become pretty much defunct. It doesn't work anymore. The World Trade Organization has become defunct. That world has gone, and these leaders are still clinging on to it. And as President Trump pointed out, they've ruined their own economies through things like net zero, cancelling fossil fuels. So Europe is in a strategically weak position. It hasn't contributed enough to NATO over the years. It hasn't sorted out its own economies, and that is why they're in the position they're in. But they're still in denial. And I feel like we've been through this before, where President Trump shakes their cage, there's a commotion, and then eventually it gets to a deal that works for everyone.
I'm going to ask you a very elemental question on the UN. I'm really glad you brought that up, because we have heard European leaders bloviate about how this board of peace that Donald Trump is about to sign an agreement for any moment now is going to destroy the UN. And we heard a soundbite there in Edward Lawrence's piece that that's going to destroy the world order. My very elemental question for you, Liz, what does the UN do?
Well, most of the things it does are bad. And we have this case in Britain of the Chagos Islands, which Britain is giving away. It's even paying Mauritius to take. And that is because of a decision by the UN Court of Justice. And Britain is the only permanent Security Council measure that actually abides by the decisions. So I believe that countries that listen to the UN often end up getting undermined. I think China has had a very strong influence in these types of decisions, and it simply doesn't work anymore. If you consider the Security Council and the permanent members include Russia and China, how are we going to achieve what we need to achieve as Western allies with them on board? Doesn't work.
I'm really glad you also mentioned the Chagos Islands. You're leading me down a great path here for this interview. President Trump not happy that Great Britain may potentially give up control of those islands, specifically one part of the island that houses a UK-US military base. He writes the following on Truth Social. Shockingly, our quote-unquote brilliant NATO ally, the United Kingdom, is currently planning to give away the island of Diego Garcia, the site of a vital U.S. military base, to Mauritius, and to do so for no reason whatsoever. Liz, why? Why is the UK transferring sovereignty of these islands now?
Well, it's because of the UN. So what has happened is the International Court of Justice on the UN has indicated that it believes it's wrong for the UK to have the Chagos Islands. And rather than challenging that, the UK government have capitulated because the country is run by lawyers who believe in international law. They believe in human rights law. We've got a human rights lawyer in Keir Starmer as Prime Minister, and they are pretty willing to sell out British interests and sell out American interests in order to keep with international law. And what President Trump is doing is he's exposing that this whole thing is a complete myth. because China doesn't abide by international law. Russia doesn't abide by international law. It's a system that doesn't work. So I think Britain, we've been complete mugs, frankly, and this is a wake-up call, and President Trump is calling it out.
And China not exactly leading the way on human rights. They are, in many instances, the #1 offender when it comes to human rights, and you have a human rights lawyer there now running the show there in your country. Are there any guarantees that Mauritius just won't back out of any leases, agreements it has with the UK, with the United States, and say, look, we're going to offer all this to China instead, which would give China a really great base of operations to potentially attack the United States?
Well, of course, there's no guarantee that that won't happen. And if you look at what's happened to Hong Kong, what China have done there, none of these countries' words can be trusted, which is why the whole international rules-based order is a sham. The United Nations hasn't worked for ages. I think there are much better uses for the building in New York than what it currently is being used for. And I'd strongly encourage President Trump to follow through and start dismantling it as an organization, because it is driving these very bad decisions like the Chagos Islands. Now, of course, Britain should be standing up for itself. Of course, we should refuse to abide by this judgment. But we have a prime minister who is beholden to these international institutions. And this is what we're seeing at Davos. We're seeing European leaders beholden to those international institutions, many of which have been infiltrated by China, and they need to be called out. And I can tell you that the people of Britain are not happy about this. We don't want to see these islands given away. It is being driven by the UN and by people in our country like Keir Starmer, who simply want to kowtow to the UN. He wants to kowtow to China. He's just approved a mega embassy in London, which will have in its basement spying facilities, so they're able to spy on critical internet cables, critical financial cables. He is just about to go to China to put his begging bowl out to President Xi, and I think it's absolutely right that President Trump is calling him out.
Liz Truss, so appreciate your insight. Former UK Prime Minister, really important insight you provided this morning, and we thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Steve Doocy.
I'm Brian Kilmeade.
And I'm Ainsley Earhart. And click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis.